How do I overcome an extremely logical mindset that questions everything I experience spiritually? Okay, so right when I'm reading this question, I can tell that the person has an identification with the mind, and not the entire mind, but there's a specific identification with the left hemisphere. That's the logical hemisphere of the brain. So you've got a right hemisphere too. So in this question, I can already feel that there's an identification. There's a sort of attachment to the left hemisphere, to the logical mind. And that means that probably when this is happening, if you're feeling that your logical mind is kind of has a grip on your life, it means that there's an identification with it, okay? And what that means is that there's a part of you that kind of believes that the world is perceived through this side, and this left hemisphere is your biggest superpower or your biggest talent. So there's a part of your identity that's attached to the idea of you having a logical mind. So at some point in your life, if you have a strong logical mind, at some point in your life, that logical mind was in command, in control. And so now if you're having a spiritual awakening, now basically the left hemisphere, the control, the logical aspect of the mind, it needs to release control, because when you're having a spiritual awakening, you really experience so much more than the left hemisphere can explain and can fathom. And so the left hemisphere starts releasing control over your life. But in this question, I can still perceive that there's some identification with the mind. So what I like to do when working with a really strong left hemisphere, this happens to so many of us when we're having a spiritual awakening. The left hemisphere is sometimes hard for it to quiet down because it's been in control and in command of our lives throughout our whole lives. And then just suddenly we have a spiritual awakening and we can't expect the left hemisphere to just be like, okay, I'm going to release control. It needs a little bit of time and patience. One of my favorite ways to kind of just overcome, you don't even need to overcome, I don't even like to use the word overcome, but one of the ways in which to release the logical mind, I like that word a little bit more, release the logical mind. A great way of doing that is through breath. And I like to use mantras or affirmations. So the more that you breathe and you use deep breaths to kind of relax your system, the more your logical mind starts to relax. And you can use mantras paired with your breathing. So you can say things like, I'm an eternal soul, I'm much more than my brain. You can even say, I have a right hemisphere too, not just a left hemisphere, and my right hemisphere of my brain is really powerful also, and it sees life in a different way than the left one. So these mantras that I'm saying, they're expansive mantras. They're getting your identification out of just the logical left brain, and they're bringing you into more of an expansive state of awareness. Breath works really, really well to do this. Affirmations work really, really well. And then at the end of the day, there's another little technique that I love using when working with the mind. And the technique is, so what? I like to call this technique the so what technique. And that is, instead of stressing out that your mind is constantly questioning everything spiritually, so you go through something spiritual and your logical mind questions it, instead of getting irritated or getting upset, just say to yourself, so what? So what if my mind questions? So what if I go through as something spiritual and my mind starts going, oh, but what about this and what about that? Who cares? You see, the moment that you step back from identification from the logical mind, it could still chitter chatter, and it probably will. It's in majority of us, our mind just keeps going on. It's the nature of the mind to think, but I don't have to be identified with it. So I could take a nice step back, I could take a nice deep breath, and even if my left brain continues to chitter chatter when I'm going through my spiritual awakening, I'm no longer identified with it. So I just observe the chitter chatter. I observe the questions that my mind is kind of questioning. I observe those questions and I just let them go. One of my favorite spiritual teachers, Thich Nhat Hanh, he has a great technique that I love, and it's when you're doing meditation and a thought comes up, just visualize that thought like a cloud that passes by in the big blue sky. And so one cloud passes by, maybe one day it's a storm, maybe the next day it's a tornado, maybe the next day it's a nice fluffy white cloud. Regardless of what cloud it is, you're just going to observe it pass by. And you can use the same technique with a strong logical mind. When your logical mind questions, you just observe and let it go. If it questions again, you observe and let it go. And this takes a little bit of practice, but the more that you step back from the logical mind, the more you start to connect with your right hemisphere, which sees the world completely in a completely different way. And the more you start to expand your awareness, pretty soon your logical mind will come in handy as a tool, as a kind of an ally in your spiritual awakening, and it'll stop sabotaging your spiritual awakening. I hope this helps.